Hey everyone, and welcome to this high-yield embryology explainer. Look, if you're gearing up for your exams right now, you already know that the timeline from gametogenesis to fertilization can feel like an absolute maze of complex cellular milestones. But don't worry, I am here to help you master it. We're going to break this whole thing down logically, step by step, so you can walk into test day with total confidence.
Okay, let's dive into this. To make it super digestible, we're organizing the material into 5 distinct buckets: shared origins, the male pathway, the female pathway, the monthly cycle, and finally, the union.
All right, starting off with Section 1, shared origins, specifically the primordial germ cells.
So before the male and female gametes diverge into these wildly different developmental paths, they actually share a common starting point. And you'll want to pay close attention to these temporal anchors right here because they frequently show up as trick questions on exams. In week 2 of development, our primordial germ cells are formed in the epiblast. Then, during week 4, they begin this epic sprawling migration from the wall of the yolk sac. By the end of week 5, they finally arrive at the developing gonads, and during this entire journey, and even after they arrive, they're multiplying rapidly via mitotic divisions just to build up a solid starting pool of cells.
Moving right along to Section 2, Spermatogenesis. This is the male pathway.
Once those initial cells arrive at the male gonads, they give rise to spermatogonial stem cells. But here's a highly testable fact. This entire reproductive process, it's put on a massive hold. The sex cords remain completely solid until puberty. Once puberty hits, boom, it's a continuous, ongoing factory line. The cords acquire a lumen and become seminiferous tubules. Through meiosis, primary spermatocytes become secondary spermatocytes, which become spermatids, which finally become spermatozoa. But hey, flag that 4th bullet point for me, spermiogenesis. Do not confuse this with spermatogenesis. It's a classic exam trap. Spermiogenesis is the specific phase where the spermatids physically transforms. It sheds its cytoplasm, develops a flagellum for a tail, and forms an acrosome. And this whole time, these developing cells are being heavily supported and literally embedded in the cytoplasmic processes of Sertoli cells.
Okay, Section 3, Oogenesis, the female pathway.
If the male pathway is basically a straight line from puberty onward, I've got to warn you, the female timeline gets wonderfully, beautifully complicated with massive, decades-long pauses. You absolutely need to memorize these milestones. By the 4th month in utero, oogonia are clustered and some are rest in prophase 1 as primary oocytes. By the 7th month, almost all of them have transformed into these primary oocytes. So the absolute crucial point is this 3rd milestone. At birth, a newborn female has strictly 0 oogonia remaining, literally none. They are all primary oocytes wrapped in a single layer of follicular cells, forming primordial follicles.
But you might be wondering, how do they just sit there arrested in prophase I? Well, enter a very high-yield exam vocabulary word, OMI, or oocyte maturation inhibitor. This tiny little peptide is secreted by the surrounding follicular cells, and it literally acts as a cellular pause button. It locks the oocytes in what's called the diplotin stage, which is a resting phase of prophase I until right before ovulation, which could be years or decades later.
Now, what's really staggering here is the sheer length of time that pause button can be pressed. An oocyte can sit perfectly dormant in that diplotin resting stage for 45 years or more. And this is exactly the clinical reason why there is an increased risk of chromosomal abnormalities with advanced maternal age. I mean, think about it. The longer a cell sits paused right in the middle of cell division, the higher the chance of microscopic errors occurring when the process finally resumes.
And as those years go on, there is a dramatic attrition rate. While a female is born with anywhere from, say, 600,000 to 800,000 primary oocytes, that number plummets to about 40,000 by puberty. Out of all of those, fewer than 500 will ever actually be ovulated in a woman's entire lifetime.
Let's lock this in by putting them side by side. If you get a question contrasting the two, just picture this logic. Male spermatogenesis begins at puberty and is a continuous, non-stop factory line. Female oogenesis begins in utero, features these massive, decades-long arrests and resting phases, and involves a huge attrition of cell numbers over time. Keep that contrasting logic cleanly cemented in your mental filing system, and you'll be golden.
Which brings us to Section 4, the monthly cycle, focusing on follicles and the corpus luteum.
This is where we look at the monthly activation phase. It's driven by a beautifully complex endocrine dance between the developing follicle and the eventual corpus luteum. Starting at puberty, about 15 to 20 follicles are selected every single month to begin maturing.
As fluid accumulates, it becomes a secondary follicle with an antrum and eventually a mature Graafian follicle. Then a massive event happens, the LH surge. This surge of luteinizing hormone pushes the primary oocyte to finally complete meiosis I. But it doesn't finish the whole process. It enters meiosis II and hits a secondary arrest point at metaphase II, about 3 hours before ovulation. It will only finish meiosis II if it is actually fertilized.
Now, post-ovulation, the remaining follicular and theca cells transform into the corpus luteum, which acts like a pump churning out progesterone to prep the uterus. And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate crossroads of the cycle. If fertilization occurs, the developing embryo's syncytiotrophoblaст produces HCG. This is a rescue signal. It saves the corpus luteum from dying so it can keep making progesterone to maintain the pregnancy. But if no fertilization occurs, the corpus luteum maxes out around 9 days, undergoes luteolysis into a fibrotic scar called the corpus albicans, progesterone plummets, and boom, menstruation begins.
Finally, Section 5, the union, fertilization.
So if all the timing aligns perfectly, our two cellular heroes finally converge in the ampullary region of the uterine tube. That's the widest part of the tube, right up close to the ovary. But before we look up the exact cellular mechanics of how they merge, I have a quick trivia question for you, just to put the staggering odds of reproduction into perspective. Out of the roughly 200 to 300 million sperm initially deposited in the female tract, how many do you think actually survive the journey to reach the ampulla?
The numbers are honestly shocking. Out of hundreds of millions, only about 300 to 500 sperm actually make it to the fertilization site. It is a rigorously brutal physical journey. And of those few hundred ultimate survivors, only one, just one, will actually fertilize the egg.
And here's the kicker. Even the survivors can't just immediately fertilize the oocyte. There are two absolute preconditions they have to meet. The first is capacitation. Think of this as a mandatory unboxing. The sperm has to spend about 7 hours conditioning in the female reproductive tract. This natural environment physically strips away a glycoprotein coat and seminal plasma proteins from the sperm's head, entirely priming it for action.
The second precondition is the acrosome reaction. Mark this down. You will almost certainly see these exact keywords on your exams. Once the sperm binds to the zona pellucida of the egg, specific zona proteins, specifically one called ZP3, trigger the sperm to release highly potent enzymes like acrosin. These enzymes are what actually allow the sperm to act like a tiny drill, physically pushing through the egg's tough outer shell.
Let's put it all together and see how this builds into the 3 distinct phases of fertilization. Phase 1, the fully capacitated sperm effortlessly passes through the outer cells known as the corona radiata. Phase 2, using those acrosin enzymes, the sperm penetrates the zona pellucida. Now, immediately upon penetration, the egg panics in a good way. It initiates a fast block via electrical depolarization and a slow block by releasing cortical granules that turn the zona from a liquid into a hard gel. This essentially turns the egg into a fortress, completely preventing any other sperm from entering. Finally, phase 3, the actual cell membranes fuse, and the sperm's genetic material enters the oocyte.
The aftermath of this fusion is beautifully precise. 3 massive things happen instantly. First, the diploid number of chromosomes is completely restored, creating a brand new unique genetic combination. Second, the genetic sex is determined right at this exact moment, depending entirely on whether that one winning sperm carried an X or a Y chromosome. And third, the egg undergoes intense metabolic activation and initiates cleavage, which kicks off the rapid cellular divisions of a brand new embryo.
I want to leave you with this final thought. If fertilization does not occur, that secondary oocyte quietly degenerates within just 24 hours of ovulation. When you zoom out and consider the decades of pausing, the hundreds of millions of sperm lost, and the absurdly precise biochemical keys required just to make one single cell, it makes you wonder, if this much fragile precision is required just to start, what kind of staggering complexity is happening in the billions of cellular divisions that follow? Keep these timelines and mechanisms organized in your head, and you are going to absolutely crush this exam. Good luck studying, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.